So with that, we are going to be transitioning into our financial panel. And I'm going to ask for Shannon and also Susie to be highlighted. Thank you so much. And I think we are good. And so before getting started into the questions, I was hoping that each of you could go around and do just a short introduction of you, your role, and what brings you to this space on financial recovery. Starting with Dr. Barton.
Yes, hi again. All right, let me think my role. What I will say is I have been in uniform as well as serving as a civilian within the armed forces now for 18 years. Yes, 18 years, and really excited to have an opportunity to just provide education with regards to what is available, in addition to ensuring that we're supporting victims through any and every process, albeit associated with dependent abuse, child abuse and neglect, and or sexual violence. Currently, my role is actually under the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program. However, I have been a lifelong advocate associated with the other side of the house when it comes to dependent abuse, as well as child abuse and neglect. So really excited to just make sure that we're connecting in terms of the civilian sector, in addition to the military, because despite the fact that, yes, the military has that all built in, I find for myself personally, as I continue within the space and sphere, that we need to make sure that we're always connecting with each other and building those relationships. So much so that I'm about to drop in chat, if I can, the DoD Domestic Abuse Victim Advocate Locator. Literally, you can use a host of different things in order to locate your nearest domestic abuse victim advocate. They have their 24/7 hotline, has all the things on there. And the department, myself, personally, I will say, when I was on that side of the house, worked really hard and continue to work hard. I know my predecessor continues to work hard to make sure that it's updated and that you all are able to connect with each other. Over.
Thank you so much. And I'll pass it over to Susie.
Great, thank you. My name is Susie Cowan. My pronouns are she, her. I am a member of the legal team at NCVLI. I've been at NCVLI for on and off for about 15 years, most recently returned in a full-time staff role on the legal team about a year ago, which is when I started working on the Military Connected Survivors Project. I think you heard from Meg yesterday or 2 days ago, and she connected people with our toolkit, which is one of our main project resources. I spent a lot of time working on that. Also in other forms at NCVLI, I've done a lot of restitution work. So I'm excited to just talk about what I know and what I've learned and what I hope everyone can just take little pieces away from this to help survivors moving forward for financial recovery. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susie and Shannon.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Shannon Freeman. I actually work currently as a federal contractor on a Department of Justice project that provides training and technical assistance to criminal justice agencies across the spectrum of the justice system. But I'm participating in this panel as the result of having spent 10 years as ombudsman of Virginia's crime victim compensation program. So I have a career background in victim advocacy, spent a lot of time in the world of crime victim compensation. I am a civilian, and Dr. Barton, every time I hear explanations or the training about transitional compensation, I'm still like, I can hear it 1,000 times and it will never completely make sense to me. So I'm glad you're there and know all of the things. And I want to underscore what folks have already said about that idea of partnership and collaboration, because it's really the only way that victims get, one, the resources that they need, and two, the resources that they, in many cases, are entitled to. So if you learn nothing else today that I say when I speak on crime victim compensation, just know that if you aren't already connected to the crime victim compensation program in your state, U.S. territory, etc., if you don't already have a contact there, I want you after this presentation is over to make that connection, because those are the partnerships you need to make before you have a victim in your office that you're scrambling to help find resources. Know those folks, know how those programs work in advance. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We're honored to have such great experts and those with lived experience on this panel. So with that, we're going to move into our first question, which is, what are priorities for advocates to know when supporting military-connected survivors financially? And whoever wants to hop off, please do.
I can start. I think there are a few things, one of which from our perspective really goes to what Shannon was saying, which is this partnerships and communication and coordination within the system, across different systems. A real priority is understanding enough, right, about the different paths of financial recovery that you can help victims understand what is the best path forward for them. And part of that understanding, right, is having people within your community establish partnerships where you can ask questions, being willing to build new partnerships to ask more questions, to learn how these different systems work together. And sort of part of that is also understanding existing resources, some of which Dr. Barton has shared, we'll be sharing as we go through. And you can always come back to us to ask for more information. And I think the sort of second big point that I would make about priorities is that we're communicating with survivors early in the process, right, about what their options are and how important it is to maintain records and to have this on their radar, right, because it's such an overwhelming process, all of the involvement within the criminal justice system, but having to come up with receipts and other things, like when everything else is going on, can be really challenging. And so to have an advocate know first to flag that, right? And then also what to look out for, what to keep track of, and how to do it can be really helpful. And then I would say that just the third priority from our perspective is being unafraid to talk about financial stuff with the survivors you're working with, right? In some communities and some cultures that can be a challenge, but to just be able to talk to the survivors you're working with about their needs and about how to accomplish what they need to get closer to full financial recovery is important. And even if it is challenging up front, the earlier you talk about it, the more often you talk about it, the more resources you have at your disposal, the easier that conversation can be. Thank you.
Hi. So the only other thing that I would add, because Susie absolutely summarized it all, I think is that importance of making sure that we are all having the conversation and how we best support the survivor. Because what ends up happening is that you refer someone to a resource, but then there is a potential that the individual didn't get the help or support that they needed. And there's a lot of a frustration point, if I'm being just honest, with every single process, every single one. So if we can work more closely in that coordinated or that multidisciplinary way, as we have that survivor identified and as we have, the needs presenting, I think that helps. Kind of putting into perspective with TCAD, the eligibility is predicated on a service member being separated through the court-martial process and or through administrative separation. That means that person or this benefit doesn't start or provide any resource financially until towards the end, or as the process has transitioned or continued through. So really important for us to make sure that we're providing the resource, the information, but then also staying in touch with each other as resource providers, so that the individuals are aware and we can help fill in the gaps and the pieces and the time as things kind of transition. That's the only thing I would.
Thank you so much. Shannon, did you want to add any?
I think that the folks speaking before me covered all the bases. The only thing I would add is that I think that military affiliated survivors have the added hurdle of having to navigate, in many instances, multiple systems, two systems. When, if you're just dealing in the sort of the civilian world, that's hard. That can be overwhelming. If you're just still dealing in the military environment, that can be intimidating. That can be tough. If you have in those spaces where you have crossover, that can be so much compounded because those are separate systems. that historically aren't very good at talking to one another, and the folks involved don't necessarily speak the same language. And so that's why you'll continue to hear us preach about that concept of collaboration and working together and having those conversations, advocates coming to the table from both sides of the case or whatever, just because the victim isn't going to be able to necessarily keep those systems straight in their own mind. It is all just people who want things from me and people that are stressing me out and hoops I have to jump through.
And it's interesting that you bring up navigating different systems and programs. That can be overwhelming, but just definitions and terms of these different programs and systems. And so with that, the next question is, what is restitution and how does it apply to military connected survivors?
Great. Yes. And as I answer this question, which is, I think, my longest answer, so just bear with me on this one. It's complicated is the sort of information up front and what Jan was saying, and it's complicated between systems, right? So restitution is going to be money that a criminal court orders a convicted person to pay to a victim for losses they incurred in connection with a crime. It's going to be something that's either part of a criminal sentence, following a plea or trial. It can be a condition of probation or supervised release. And so there are lots of different parts to what that definition is. And some of that's going to come into, there are a few sub-questions here. And if it's okay, Kim, I'll just start on them. So the first one is, how does this apply to military connected survivors? And then we're going to talk about what the requirements of restitution are. So how restitution applies to military connected survivors in a few ways, right? Restitution is one of the paths to financial recovery that we're talking about today. And it's a path, there's a right to restitution within civilian systems, legal systems, criminal legal systems, and within the military criminal legal system. It looks very different in both systems. In the civilian side, there are state laws and federal laws that govern restitution. Depending on where a criminal case is being tried, what jurisdiction, who has jurisdiction over that case, that's going to determine what restitution laws apply. In the military system, while there is a right to restitution, it does not really look the same. It's less straightforward than in the civilian systems. It's just not as common of a path to financial recovery based on existing benefits and structures within the military and how non-judicial punishment works and how command can reallocate like payment and sort of rank and other things outside of the judicial process that will look like, those payments will look like what restitution looks like in the civilian side. And that's going to be a more common path to that money is through negotiation, through these other non-judicial processes. And all of that is to say that there is this right, it exists in military systems, but you want to be in contact with the military victims' rights attorneys who are working in a case, the military victim advocate. They are going to have more information about how it's going to work on an individual basis, just because it is pretty uncommon. I think a civilian restitution order is going to be more meaningful than perhaps a military one, but military pursuing financial recovery through the military system is going to come with other benefits, other sources of money, right? And so those are just things that you need to think about and talk about with the survivor as they're choosing their path forward. And then getting more detailed into sort of what you need to get restitution. We talked about 4 things, right? It's a criminal conviction for a victim for certain losses that are connected to a crime, right? So first, you have this criminal conviction piece, which is what Dr. Barton was talking about. We're talking about pretty deep into the process, right? So we've gone through trial, we've gotten a plea, something like that, but you've been involved in the process for a while. And then the next piece of that is you have a victim who's eligible for restitution. So this is some of what I think Meg mentioned yesterday in the Victims' Rights 101. Who is a victim? Who's entitled to rights? That's going to be very jurisdiction specific, and it's going to be different. Even the definition of victim that entitles you to different participatory rights, right? It could be different than the victims who are entitled to restitution. Again, that's like connecting with the prosecutor, talking to a victim's rights attorney, trying to figure out who meets that definition. And then what losses can be compensated. Again, jurisdiction specific, but a lot of jurisdictions are going to say a victim is entitled to restitution for all economic losses connected to the crime, right? And so that's really broad, and that's great. And a lot of stuff can fall under that. There are going to be other jurisdictions where they're more specific, and it's victims entitled to restitution for medical losses, lost income, other sort of specific things. And there are ways to broaden those too, that are going to be, again, talking to the prosecutor, talking to an attorney, but that's the compensable losses part of it. And then the final part is going to be this causal connection, the relationship between the crime that occurred and the losses that the victim suffered. And sometimes those losses, it's really obvious, right? And unfortunately, even when it's really obvious to us, there's a clear connection. It may not fit the causation standard, the legal standard in a jurisdiction. And some of that can be depending on what crime has been charged. So if you have a domestic abuse charge, that's going to be easier to see that connection legally and just intuitively between injuries or other losses sustained as a result of domestic abuse, as opposed to a disorderly conduct charge or something like that, right? Where it's sometimes what we see instead of a more like violence. And so that becomes a little bit harder to make those connections. So part of why it's important to be involved at the process in the beginning, talking to the prosecutor, making sure the victim is in contact with the prosecutor related to charging decisions. And again, this is like this early involvement that matters for that. And so this just goes back to what we keep saying. It's really complicated. So you just need to know who's out there and who you can talk to. And I'm going to put in a few links for resources that we have. One is a toolkit different than the toolkit we've been talking about. Otherwise, this is just a victims' rights toolkit with a restitution piece to it. The fourth piece was the causation. Sorry, let me just try and get that. I'm just going to go back and answer these questions. For whatever reason, I'm not getting sorry. So we had, just to go back through those four, and then I will continue with my links and move on. But it was a criminal conviction, a victim who's eligible, losses that are compensable, and a causal connection between them. And, oh, sorry, Ava, thank you. I will continue to put a few things in the chat, but I'm going to just turn it over now to the next question.
Thank you for that explanation, and also for the resource as well. So what is crime victim compensation, and how does this apply? Same kind of questions. How does this apply to the military connected survivors, and what are those requirements?
All right, I'll jump in for this one. Crime victim compensation programs are government programs that are federally funded. They're across the country. Every U.S. state and territory has a crime victim compensation program. Also, if you look outside of the U.S., there are also some crime victim compensation programs internationally in other countries, mostly in developed nations. What's interesting about crime victim compensation, I think lots is interesting about it, but what we're talking about is reimbursement to or on behalf of a victim of a violent crime on a wide range of benefits that they may be available for. Medical benefits or dental benefits, mental health counseling, funeral or burial expenses in homicide cases. But again, and similar to what we were hearing earlier about restitution, crime victim compensation is an appropriate referral for a very sort of specific category of individual. Because to be eligible for crime victim compensation, we have to be talking about a crime incident that was reported to law enforcement. Now, for the purposes of crime victim compensation, how it plays out in most states, report to military police is just as fine, works just as well, or in a report to Child Protective Services or a report to Adult Protective Services can stand in for a report to municipal law enforcement agency. But we also know that there are a lot of victims of violent crime who never ever report that crime to law enforcement. Those victims, while no less victims, would not be eligible for crime victim compensation. Not only are we looking at reporting the crime to law enforcement, there are also some guidelines related to reporting that crime promptly to law enforcement. And that varies as you look across the pantheon of compensation programs, because here's the thing that makes it extra fun. While crime victim compensation programs are funded to a large extent by the Victims of Crime Act, funding, VOCA, and some of you may be VOCA funded in the work that you do, who are on the call today. And so there are VOCA guidelines that dictate some of the ways that comp programs work. But each of those programs in every state, each of those programs is run separately and independently, whether out of the governor's office of that state or the attorney general's office of that state or the workers' compensation board of that state. It can be placed anywhere that state's legislature decided to put this program. And so everyone works a little bit differently. So while all of them are providing resources to victims of violent crime, what that looks like in each state varies. So it's hard to give you the sort of the 50,000-foot view because we all live in the day-to-day, the sort of nuts and bolts. And that's why I always encourage people to connect with the program that serves where you are, where you're doing the advocacy work that you're doing. When we are looking at crime victim compensation, a victim has to have reported to law enforcement, there are some prompt report guidelines, but there are exceptions to that. In a particular state, it may be the crime has to have been reported to law enforcement in 5 days or 72 hours or whatever the state's requirement is. But in most situations, if a victim can show good cause for the delay in reporting, the compensation program can still take that application. And it is in most states a paper application. Technology hasn't always caught up to our crime victim compensation programs. They're typically having to fill out a paper application and have it notarized. This is where advocates can be of a tremendous help, helping them fill out that application. Because when they're filling out that application, they're giving information about the crime because they have to we are talking about a certain subset of eligible crimes. So we're looking at violent crimes, we're looking at crimes against a person. So we're looking at things like sexual assault, domestic violence, simple assault, homicide, arson. The list can go on, but it may vary state to state how that state defines a violent crime against a person. They're filling out that application and they're submitting it. They need to make sure that they meet filing deadlines for within the state where they're filing. And you file based on where the crime occurred. I am here, I'm talking to you all from Virginia. I'm in Central Virginia, Richmond. Next week, thank you to the heavens, I'm on vacation and I'll be at the beach in North Carolina. Were I to be a victim of crime in North Carolina, I would apply, even though I'm a Virginia resident, to North Carolina's crime victim compensation program. And I see someone put in the chat, Texas allows up to 2 years to report through their Office of the Attorney General. Yes, and so that filing deadline is important because it could be 1 year from the date of crime, it could be 2 years from the date of crime, it's going to vary. Again, victims can get applications in and reviewed if they can provide a good cause for the delay. Someone who was never told about comp, for instance, didn't know the program existed, discovered it after the deadline has passed. Most state programs would accept that. I will say that when we look at state crime victim compensation programs or the crimes that they're dealing in, they're not just looking at crimes that occurred that are being heard or adjudicated in state courts. crimes that occurred on federal lands, if we're talking about tribal land or state parks or military bases, crime victim compensation within that state can still someone can still file for that. I would say the piece about military involved victims, the challenge, I think, specifically for them is because the crime victim compensation program is a civilian sort of civilian landscape that they're navigating, they are going to need law enforcement information from if it's being investigated on base by military police. They're going to need information from that investigator, a copy of that police report, and sometimes those systems aren't great at playing with each other. I do a 2-hour training on crime victim compensation for the Victim Academy, so it's hard to distill it as the answer to a question. But what's important to know is victims apply with a paper application. At that time, they request benefits. And when I say request benefits, what I mean is the victim has gotten medical attention and has a bill. They're sending it to the comp program to pay it or to reimburse the victim if they've paid out of pocket for something. Crime victim compensation does stand as payer of last resort. So they stand back and see what else is a potential payer for any specific expense. So if I have health insurance, my health insurance pays, but I have a copay, that's my obligation. Crime victim compensation would reimburse me for my copay or pay that copay amount directly to the provider, not send payment for the entire bill amount. And by federal law, crime victim compensation is payer of last resort. I can entertain many more questions about it, but I'll let us move on to other panel topics.
Thank you. I didn't know if any of the panelists had something to add to that, or if I can go ahead to the next question.
The only thing that I have to add is that's why it's so important for the advocates and the supporting system to truly make sure that we're all communicating with each other. I can't tell you the host of times that it was working with that individual at the Crime Victim Compensation Board program and really supporting that victim allowed, as a military advocate, allow for that person to get the help or assistance that they needed, because if the victim had to do it by themselves and navigating, to Shannon's point, military police and getting requests and reports, it can be absolutely taxing. So just making sure that we're all staying connected and really working to support the victim and talking through it with them.
Thank you. All right, for the next question, can a victim qualify for compensation, transitional compensation, and restitution?
I can answer that. Yes, they can for all of them. Restitution, it's important to be asking for all of those things because there's going to be some overlap, but also a lot of different things being covered by different paths to financial recovery.
And I will add, sorry.
Go ahead.
I will add that crime victim compensation is covering very specific benefits. There are benefit categories that are set out in state's code, for instance. And we're looking, as we were when we were talking about restitution, we're looking at causality. We have to be able to directly link what the victim is asking to have covered by the compensation program to the crime. There has to be a direct line there. Crime victim compensation in most states will assist with moving expenses, and that's typically capped. It's a capped amount. It can be up to $2,000 towards moving expenses, up to $1,000, $1,500, $3,000, whatever it is in that particular state. But if someone calls the comp program and says, I need money to buy groceries for my family, crime victim compensation doesn't have a grocery category. We're reimbursing money that's already been paid out. And that could be lost wages or something like that. But there are certain things that comp just doesn't have the bandwidth to cover. It doesn't fall into one of their categories. So I think it's always a good idea for individuals to apply for each of these systems, because there may be things that can fall under one of these funding sources that doesn't fall under the other.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Barton?
So the only other thing that I did have to add is, for instance, so Shannon's example about groceries, that being something that is in this moment necessitated. That's where, in the event it was a military connected survivor or victim, that's the nature of ensuring that personnel are aware of what command can do, in addition to supporting through the different programs, i.e. we have emergency relief funds that do offer loans and grants, and just a host of diverse factors. I think that's the part of making sure that personnel have the awareness of how civilians and military advocates are working together. And I do see a question in the chat, and I'm not sure if we're going to answer now or if we should stand by.
Yes, the question regarding from Eric, in relation to a crime that occurred on base, what will be the documents needed to file for crime compensation?
All compensation programs do an administrative review. So when an application gets in, they're going to review that application. They're going to see what benefits are being requested. First and foremost, they're going to need information about the crime, because they have to determine that it is a crime that falls in their purview, that we are talking about a violent crime against a person. And they also have to determine issues around contribution and cooperation. Those are big topics in crime victim compensation. I started the bar fight, but didn't win it and got my butt kicked, and now I have medical bills. That is not necessarily going to be a claim that is awarded in crime victim compensation, because the compensation program may make the determination that behavior by the claimant contributed to their own injury, right? They have to determine, in many states code sections, it says innocent victim of violent crime. So they're looking for that causal relationship between, or did the victim contribute to the crime in some meaningful or causal way. They're going to want investigative reports. So not just that sort of sheet that law enforcement agencies can provide that shows the date of the call and the responding officer and victim's name, offender's name. They're going to want narrative information if there is narrative information. Also, what a lot of comp programs do is they send a separate form to the investigating officer and ask them to fill out and ask questions about cooperation. Was the victim cooperative with law enforcement efforts? A description of what happened. And in some states, they will ask the investigator's opinion about contribution. Was the victim's behavior contributory? Now, we can have a 3-hour conversation about the issue of victim blaming and things like that. That's certainly not the intent of crime victim compensation programs, but I will say that they are an administrative process, not a judicial one. And so they are interested in the facts of the case, but the outcome of the case criminally does not have to. Okay, best way to say this: a person can be the victim of a crime and an arrest can never be made. They don't make an arrest or it doesn't go to court. That doesn't mean the victim's not cooperating. There's a lot of discretion there. Beyond that, case may get to court and the offender may be found not guilty. That also doesn't mean that the victim can't receive crime victim compensation, even if there's a not guilty verdict. On the flip side of that, there could be a guilty verdict and a crime victim compensation claim, that administrative process, that claim could still be denied. Again, I mentioned the earlier example of started the bar fight but didn't win it, the drug deal gone bad, things like that. But I think that crime victim compensation programs across the board through the Office for Victims of Crime are really reimagining what their role is in advocacy. And part of some new initiative is to, I think, reduce barriers and make access easier for all victims, particularly around that issue of cooperation, that issue of reporting to law enforcement, what qualifies a report to law enforcement. So there are a lot of changes right now happening in the field of crime victim compensation.
Thank you for clarifying that. I didn't know if the other panelists have anything to add to that, or not, we'll go to the next question. Okay. Number 5, you answered this because of how complicated restitution sounds, but can a victim seek restitution on their own?
They can. So it depends on the jurisdiction always, right? But in a lot of jurisdictions, victims can ask for restitution themselves or through their attorney. In some jurisdictions, they're going to need to go through the prosecutor. In many instances, they'll want that prosecutor to be the person asking for restitution on their behalf. There are lots of rights that we could ask prosecutors to enforce for victims. And so that communication with the prosecutor is going to be pretty key throughout the process. I know we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to be really quick. But one thing that I wanted to put in the chat is this link, which is goes to this question and the point I made before about what you need to file a request for restitution and how you can track it. And this is just a sample restitution log that we use, and it's a way of organizing and helping survivors organize what they need in order to support a restitution claim. And so I just wanted to make sure everyone saw that. And that's my quick answer.
Okay, thank you. I'll have one more question and turn it over to Ava. If a convicted person has no assets, what is the purpose of restitution?
So there are a few purposes beyond financial recovery. First, assets can be acquired, right? So you can get an order for restitution and the convicted person may inherit assets, they may receive a big gift, they may win the lottery. And a lot of those, if you have an order in place, that money is going to be recoverable for the most part, depending on if the court still has jurisdiction, what type of order it is, where you are. But having that order in place, even if there's no immediate chance of recovery, can be good sort of long-term thinking, right? There are these other components, right, non-financial. So it really validates the victim's losses. It's a public statement that goes with a public acknowledgement of accountability. And it says the court's recognizing the harm that the victim suffered, right? And assigning it a dollar amount, but still recognizing it to be the case. And that can be very powerful. And it also helps like reincorporate victims into the process. So if you have this court order in the record with a victim's name on it, the court has them on their radar more. Parole and probation have the victim sort of more on their radar, right? So you're getting these things that you're entitled to anyway, like notification, inclusion in the process, right to be heard, right to be present, right? Those are things that exist anyway, but we do sometimes see trouble with enforcement. But if you're on the court's radar, you're more likely to get those things. It's sort of just what we've seen. One small piece of that, though, is it's important to, again, talk to the survivor as you're going through this process. So this person doesn't have money or they don't have a lot of money. And so recovery, collection of restitution may look like 10 cents a month or something like that. And what does that mean for you? Is it better to have, say, your attorney collect those checks for the course of the year and then give them to you? Is that constant reminder and this monthly payment system something that works for the survivor, especially if it's not meaningfully contributing financially to them? And what are other avenues that you can go about, like how you can use an attorney, how maybe you donate it and you just don't see it. They're just different things to think about when there isn't real money on the line.
Great, thank you so much. Did anyone else want to add to that? Good, okay. I'm going to share my screen to bring up the hypothetical. And then we also do have some questions there for our panel members. So I'm going to read just the second half because it is the same content from the beginning session. So now that Jennifer and service member Jones are separated and Jennifer is living off of the insulation with the 3 children, Jennifer is paying for housing and food for the 4 of them without any financial contributions from Jennifer's estranged spouse, intimate partner. Jennifer and their children all receive mental health counseling that is connected to service member Jones's conduct. Jennifer has paid for past counseling without assistance from service member Jones and has future counseling appointments scheduled. Jennifer has family in California and Washington who are willing to offer them and their children assistance, but the travel logistics from Alaska are daunting and expensive. Jennifer believes moving away from Alaska is necessary for their own mental and physical safety, as well as that of their children. Service member Jones has control over Jennifer's savings and is preventing Jennifer from accessing those funds. Jennifer asked the military victim advocate for guidance on paying for these expenses and obtaining access to their savings. Jennifer reaches out to their victim advocate and attorney with questions about whether there are any financial resources available to help with expenses like counseling costs, relocation expenses, and food and housing. So moving on to the questions. I can't see anyone anymore for some reason. My computer just hid everyone. So first question for not only the panel members, but also everyone else in the chat. Is Jennifer eligible for crime victim compensation in Alaska, where the military criminal case against service member Jones is pending, but Jennifer has yet to report their conduct to civilian law enforcement? Does the eligibility analysis change if Jennifer does report to civilian law enforcement? Any thoughts on that from the attendees or additional information that is good to know from the panel? What do you all think?
So, hi, I will chime in first. I'm associated with transitional compensation for abuse dependents. We aren't quite there yet. And the reason that we're not quite there yet is by virtue of we don't have the military case or the military event resolved quite yet, and or we don't have civilian charges that subsequently led to an associated separation or courts martial. For transitional compensation, we're not there quite yet. However, what we would actually be looking to do is work with the service members command to ensure that the eligible benefits, since this member is still in uniform, are being appropriately afforded to the spouse and the kids, because in the event that the children are listed on his actual record, when it comes to them being dependents of his, then they are also still eligible for military connected benefits through the time that the outcome is had. Over.
Thank you.
I would say I'm interested in seeing here the military, there's a military criminal case, but she hasn't reported to civilian law enforcement. She wouldn't have necessarily, I can't speak for Alaska's crime victim compensation program. I've never worked there. I just know enough to be dangerous about Alaska's specific program. But in most states, she wouldn't have to specifically report to civilian law enforcement. A crime victim compensation claim could be based on the military investigation, as long as we have a sort of specific date of crime to root the crime victim compensation claim to, because comp claims are based on a specific on a crime. And with domestic violence, you can see he was abusive and violent over the course of however many months or years, but that comp claim is going to need a specific date of crime, that an assault or something that was reported to law enforcement. So I'd be interested in the nature of that specific investigation, but would encourage the victim to apply, because things like moving expenses, which could be, helping with the transport to family out of getting her out of Alaska, et cetera, comp can assist with that potentially.
Thank you so much. And so I'll jump to the second half of 1A. Is there a cap on the amount of compensation Jennifer can receive? That's for the panel.
In crime victim compensation, yes, there is a cap, and that's going to vary from state to state, but comp programs on average it's up to about $30,000. So again, Alaska, though, I think is actually $40,000. That does not mean that the victim applies. If they are deemed eligible, they then have a $40,000 check waiting for them in their mailbox. It means up to $40,000 in crime-related expenses. And then once they reach that cap, that max, then they wouldn't be eligible for future benefits based on that specific claim.
Thank you. And oh, yes, Dr. Barton.
Now, in the event that service member Jones does actually get convicted of a crime and or administratively separated associated with the dependent abuse offense and has been on active duty 30 days or more, which I would think that is the case based on the scenario here, there would be a cap based upon the nature of how the breakdown is. So once again, those rates are predetermined, and what it is the spouse, as long as she's not cohabitating, doesn't remarry, and did not aid or abet in any type of child abuse, would get a payment, and then each subsequent dependent, there would be an additional sum added on associated with. And once again, that's either the minimum of 12 months all the way up to 36 months of benefits. So that would be the cap. It isn't a one size fits all. So we've had cases that had one spouse and 9 children, for instance, and that sum of funds is absolutely what we ended up paying comparatively to one adult and one child. Over.
Thank you. And to expand on 1B, are there any requirements on what that money can be spent on once the victim survivor receives victim compensation?
With crime victim compensation, it's going to be specifically, crime victim compensation is going to be paid where money is owed. If money is owed to a funeral home in a homicide, money is owed to a doctor or a physical therapist. If the balance is due there, that's where crime victim compensation is going to direct payment. If the victim has paid out of pocket, then that money is going to go to the victim directly.
Thank you. And a question in the chat, is this a slow process for most victims to receive compensation?
Crime victim compensation can be a slow process. It can take anywhere from 1 month to 6 months for a claim to be awarded. It's an administrative process. It's the government giving out money, so they're dotting I's and crossing T's. It is most cases claims go through most efficiently when victims are working with advocates who are helping them gather the documents, provide the copies of bills or explanations of benefit statements from their insurance provider, for instance, showing what they owe. When victims are responsive to requests from the compensation program, and the other players are responsive as well. So the law enforcement agency involved in investigating if the comp program's writing for itemized billing information and medical records to make sure that the bills that are submitted are directly related to the crime. If they're getting that information back promptly, it moves much more quickly.
Thank you. And to clarify a question in the chat, so the compensation doesn't go directly to the victim. And can we clarify that for restitution, crime victim compensation, and transitional compensation?
For restitution, it almost always is going to go to the victim because these aren't usually outstanding bills. They might be, but the restitution process is even a lot longer than the compensation process. A lot of these things have been resolved. They can go directly if there is an amount owed and the timing works out. I think it could, but for the most part, the money is going to the victim.
For transitional compensation, the funds are going directly to the victim. As part of the application submission process, even prior to the individual being approved, they actually have to submit a electronic funds transfer to annotate to the federal government where they would like the funds to be deposited. At this point, they can issue a check monthly. However, that's a very lengthy process for DFAS to pay out through a check. What they are doing as part of the process is requesting the account information, and it is the victim's responsibility to ensure that they're keeping their payee information updated, because should they change accounts, something close, etc., wouldn't know, and they would end up recouping the funds based upon it not going through. But then the victim would subsequently have to follow up with that. Over.
Thank you. And for victim compensation, I believe, Shannon, you said that it's paid to the debt that's owed. Is that correct?
Yes, if the victim has paid out of pocket, then they get reimbursed for what they paid out of pocket. Also, if the victim has applied for lost wages because they have missed time from work as a result of injuries related to the crime, for instance, and they have missed time from work for which they weren't paid, and they were getting wage loss, that money would go directly to the victim. Prescriptions that they've paid for, that money would go directly to the victim. Anything that they've submitted and paid out of pocket gets reimbursed to them. That's crime related.
Thank you. And we have a few questions in the Q&A. Can these same resources apply to ROTC programs and cadets?
As far as transitional compensation, it cannot, based upon the requirement, unless the individual participating in ROTC or cadet is a dependent of an existing military member. But to say that it would be applicable for that person, they're not quite yet, because they're not serving on active duty within those statuses. So it's a bit nuanced. Now, with that being said, the military, of course, would be open and supportive to, or whichever academy or program would be open and supportive to helping bridge the gap associated with, but at this time, no ROTC unless the individual is married to somebody who's already a serving member. Over. Which I don't believe you can actually be married in any of those programs. So, yeah.
I know we're getting short on time. Although we didn't answer all the questions, I do encourage each of the attendees to review the hypothetical and just go over some of these questions. And if there's any outstanding questions, we can send them to our panel members. But I did want to provide any closing statements from our panel members on maybe what is the best advice or information we can give advocates and community professionals, whether that's military or civilian, as we talk about financial recovery.
I think it's just going back to the main theme from this. Think about all of this ahead of time, right? Do a little bit of work now, follow up while you're still thinking about it. Think about what restitution looks like in your jurisdiction, find out who you need to contact for comp. Think about transitional comp within your own space, right? Not the sort of general overview that we're giving, because there's going to come a point in time where you need this information. And it's great to just have it in your mind, or a list of places to go to figure it out later. But it's so great to have everybody just here today listening to us as we talk about these very sort of separate things. And we encourage you all to work together, because we know how well that they can work together and supplement one another. And it's really best for survivors if they have access to all of these programs.
I would just add that compensation programs, many have robust training arms, training components. They want to talk to you about how they do business, because when advocates understand how they do business, it makes their job easier, right? They get better applications. The victims that come to them are more informed about what to expect through the process. So please reach out to the compensation program that serves where you are, whether you're in a state or a territory. Reach out to that comp program, ask them. They'll get on a Zoom, they'll do Zoom trainings with you, or they'll come to a staff meeting. They want to know how you work too. So make those connections.